Yeah, so first Carl's going to present the method, findings, and summarise some of the key learnings and takeaways, and then we're going to hear from Pat, who's was a community midwife and advises on liaising and supporting people at Worthing Food Foundation. So she's going to talk a bit more about how they implement all these findings in practice. We're aiming for about an hour and 45 minutes. We scheduled a little bit longer in case we really get into the Q&A. We probably won't do a break, but if you obviously need to pop off, you can. The meeting is being recorded, so you can catch up on any bits you might miss after. And if you need to take a tea break and take your laptop around with you or grab a late lunch or whatever, absolutely no shame, go ahead. So I guess a little bit of background about the research. This is a partnership with Adur and Worthing Food Partnership and the University of Brighton back in, I think, 2021. And the aim is to kind of better understand people's experiences and insights in the community food support that they were receiving. So it's thank you to Carl and his team for carrying out the research. And also a huge thanks goes to the people who contributed and who took part and sat through the interviews. So I think that's it from me. Carl, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. Just to give a bit of context to my own background, because you'll probably see a few different hats being worn here, folks. I'm a community psychologist from the University of Brighton, so my day job is in working with community groups around supporting people with mental health problems. But I'm also Deputy Leader of Worthing Council, and I also helped to set up the Worthing Food Foundation a couple of years ago. So I've got multiple different kind of hats here, which you might see at different times in this talk. Some of the stuff I say in this talk might be quite challenging, but I'm hoping it's taken in a constructive way. Okay, so let's kick off. The scale of the need is for those of us who are working in the emergency food support sector, or have been, even before the pandemic, even before this year with the energy costs and inflation, we had something in the region of 6 million adults and 1.7 million children living in food insecurity. That translates to a town like Worthing, which is a relatively affluent town, to 12,000 people living in food insecurity. If you look at the numbers who are getting support, it's far, far lower than that. So there's a huge amount of hidden hunger and unmet need. And so let's keep that backdrop. That's the backdrop to what we're about to talk about here. The problem, or one of the problems we've got, is that we're in a situation now where food banks are understood, or they have become part of the response, the community-based response to hunger and to food insecurity. They've never been a solution to food insecurity or hunger, even during times where they weren't quite as challenging as they are now. But if you look at research from the recent Independent Food Aid Network survey, since October 21, we've seen something like a 90% of organisations saw a demand rise since April 2022. In our own organisation for Worthing Food Foundation, we started at the beginning of 2020, I think, and we had 14 families. And now that organisation is supporting 500 people a week. So you can see the scale of the increase. 80% of food banks, independent food banks, reported problems with supply issues, with 1 in 5 needing to reduce the size of their food parcels. And again, I reiterate, they were, on the whole, they're still not meeting the need for food insecurity out there. 72% of organisations have reported that food donation levels have dropped, which is to be expected with the cost of living going up. And 68% of organisations say they may not be able to support everyone who needs their help, or have had to reduce the size of the food parcels. So what you've got here is a sector, a food bank sector, a community support sector that is really on its knees. And I can't emphasize that enough. There are a lot of food banks that are really close to the brink, close to collapse, and having to make really difficult decisions in terms of what they're able to give people who are in real need. So this is the background to what I'm going to talk about when I talk about hunger trauma. We did a piece of research. I did it as part of my day job at University of Brighton with the Adur and Worthing Food Network. 18 people took part. We did in-depth interviews using something called photo elicitation, because sometimes when you talk to people about really difficult, tricky and challenging experiences in their lives, it's not always easy for them to articulate that in conversation. So photo elicitation is where you invite people to take photographs, and you use the photographs as a prompt in order to discuss their experiences of using food bank and their experiences of hunger. I'm going to go through some of the key things that have come out of this. I'm going to make some recommendations, and then I'm going to hand over to Pat, who will talk about what this looks like on a day-to-day basis. Before people get to the food bank, many are already struggling, that many are experiencing a real sense of desperation. If you look at this quote from Sam, oh, well, I think I'm getting used to, you get used to the hunger, so I'll feel hungry. And then, you know, you've got work to do and get on with it, and that takes away from the need. So this keeping busy stops me feeling it. And then I go home and then there's the pain. What do you do next? What have you got? Jane said, I mean, before we were getting the food bank, we would literally probably not eat for a couple of days until we had the money to go out and buy the food. So what you find is that before people get to a food bank, and this is resonant for all the people we talk to, and actually and many people using emergency food support, you know, they have got to a pretty parlous point before they get to a food bank. They are often desperate, often hungry, and often really struggling. I'm going to talk at this. I'm going to use this term hunger trauma, because if you look at the research out there, there's plenty of research out there that talks about the psychological consequences of hunger and of using food banks. And it's often understood through mental health terms like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and people talk about social elements such as shame and humiliation. But the problem with these terms is I think that it loses context. It focuses on individual subjective distress, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but it takes away what is causing this, where it comes from. And I actually think if you want to look at the way in which the psychosocial experiences of hunger and using food and using food support, I think once you start to open this up, it's deeper than depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and shame. It's a form of trauma that people are subjected to, but it's a form of trauma that is, and this is where I won't get party political. I'll try not to, but it is political, it's economic, it's relational, how you interact with people, and it's felt. It's an embodied trauma. I'm going to try and describe what this trauma looks like and feels like for people, but I want to make the point that I think it's quite distinct in nature from other experiences of trauma due to the different experiences that people have. Okay, I think it's a particular type of trauma that relates to emotional distress, to guilt, to feelings of destitution, and that attacks people's very fundamental sense of their identity and their status in society. There is a dehumanizing aspect of hunger where those in need feel stripped of social value. They're made to feel useless because they're experiencing a very sustained attack on their very sense of who they are, the fact that they no longer feel autonomous or self-sufficient or able to look after themselves or their families. The trauma that they feel it goes right down to the status that they have. We often experience multiple forms of guilt around whether they're entitled to this, because, you know, being in poverty is something that over the last 10, 12 years in particular has been increasingly frowned upon in political discourse and in the media. We've seen that big rise in poverty porn, all those programs about families living on benefits. So there's a real guilt around whether you're even entitled to something, but also a guilt for many of the people who talked to Kate, who I spoke to, about not being able to feed their families, not taking on the fundamental role that they want to take on as a caregiver. There's the physical pain and the fatigue of living in hunger, and then there's a constant worry and anxiety of living in perpetual crisis. Hunger there's a political economy of hunger trauma. There's various large-scale societal forces that I think are translated into personal distress and forms of trauma. If you look at individual case studies of suffering, they tell us what happens to individual people, but you lose some of that broader political economy that is driving this. But if we don't talk about this and we don't pay attention to it, we risk silencing the experience of those who are in need. I'll give you, I mean, there's so many different ways we can talk about what that kind of political and economic impact is. But we all know since the 2012 Welfare Reform Act, we've seen the benefits cap, the freezing of child benefit, the reversing of the £20 universal credit increase. You've got the cutting of local housing allowance. You've got and housing benefit. We now see record inflation. You see stagnating wages and against a backdrop of energy costs, which are spiraling out of control. People on this call can maybe convince me otherwise, but I don't think that our great fiscal statement today is going to change any of that. In fact, I think it's probably like to make it worse. So what when we talk about indignity and shame and worry, this constant crisis of food trauma, people talk about, this is why it's very difficult. And it's why you've got to be really careful about how you protect food support encounters, which I'll come to in a bit, because people coming to those encounters are in a state of crisis. Sam says, it feels like there's no break from any of it. It's just a constant cycle of stress and worry, and it really brings you down. It brings me to tears now because I've never really told anybody it's this bad. But, you know, for me, working here just distracts me from all the shit that goes on at home. I won't talk about all the quotes, folks, but I wanted to put a few on the slides. But please look at the slides and look at all the quotes in your own time. There's a dehumanizing effect of hunger where people really do genuinely feel stripped of the sense of value that they had before they found themselves living in hunger. So the things that happened whilst all this was going on, and I had to go and see the doctor who put me on antidepressants to take at night to sleep because I couldn't sleep at all because I was so worried about it. Jane says we were both getting used to really bad mentally with our health, to the point that at one point, September last year, both of us on separate occasions wanted to jump off the bridge because we couldn't cope with anything anymore. The extent of this trauma, the extent of this crisis is so extreme that it drives people to sleeplessness, it drives them to constant worry and anxiety, and it drives some people to very, very profound mental distress, including feeling suicidal. Shame is a big part of this, but it's not the only part. Shame is a family of emotions that include embarrassment, guilt, and humiliation. And it's a social thing. People often feel shame because they feel that poverty is dismissed as self-inflicted, that they bring it upon themselves. And that shame and that stigma is so powerful that it means people will skip meals, they'll eat out-of-date food, they'll go hungry before they come to food banks. They will do whatever they can to avoid coming to emergency food support. And the shame of poverty happens when we fail in the eyes of others. And so when the eyes of others are on you during that situation, that sense of feeling stigma is really profoundly heightened. This Sally says, that's really tough because, you know, it's like, I don't want the neighbors to see. And, you know, of course it has my name and address on the bags. And, you know, sometimes if I've been out and they're left outside, I really struggle with that. You know, she literally went all day without any food, didn't tell me. And it's only the fact that I got an email saying your daughter did not come home and collect her lunch because she's embarrassed by it. You know, the thought of having to go to a food bank is even worse. She said, you know, I'm glad, mummy, that they come here, she said, because people probably think we're just getting shopping delivered, because she's so embarrassed by it. I mean, I haven't admitted it to a lot of people. So there's not just, the shame doesn't just come from the way that people who are using food banks feel. It comes from the experiences that their families, that their children have to go through. Identity and status is a big part of this. Food is a central constituent part of identity. It's like your clothes. You get up in the morning and you choose what clothes you want to wear, and you put your clothes on that you feel comfortable in, that match the way you see yourself in the world. If somebody came into your room and started to dress you in the morning with clothes of their choice, it would impact the way you see yourself. And it's the same with food, people using food support. When the choice of your food is taken away from you and other people are choosing your food for you, it impacts the way you see yourself as a person. It's quite a dehumanizing experience, however useful it is in ameliorating hunger. And the referral process is also one that people talk about as being dehumanizing. You know, for those food banks who do use a referral process, often where you have to go via the CAB or go via GP practice or a third party, people feel that they have to prove that they're hungry, that they can't be trusted. Non-referral food banks work on a premise that if somebody says that you are hungry, you accept that and you support them. I felt like I was inadequate, I suppose is the word. I couldn't provide for my partner and myself. I've worked all my life since leaving school. I've been working. People talk about food support as a mixed blessing. You're going to think I'm saying exactly the opposite probably to what other people are saying, but it makes me really down when I get a food bank delivery. It doesn't lift my mood because it's a realization that I'm having to ask for it. So people get this mixed experience when they actually receive food support, because it reminds them, it reinforces this sense of failure and this sense of shame and the change in their identity and their status. But at the same time, I mean, I did a delivery the other day for our food bank, and it's tricky because I remember I knocked on the door, gave the bags of food to a mum, and I heard as I was walking away, I heard the door closing. She explained it. I heard her say to a 3-year-old daughter, "Don't worry, it's here now." And so, you know, as much as the shame is related to that, there's also a sense of real desperation for this food arriving. You can only imagine the conversation between that daughter and that mum about how hungry they are before that arrived. So it's very complicated. It's very complex, the relational interactions that happen when you give people food support. One of the difficult elements of food support is the fact that you lose control over what you eat, as I mentioned. I mean, I do try to make things from scratch using these tinned tomatoes. I suppose it does. I mean, the tins of soup, we're not really big soup eaters apart from tomato soup. So I think if you just rely on it, you know, it does kind of control what you eat. People talk about guilt. Yeah, so my youngest is 6 and I've got a 12-year-old daughter and I've got a 14-year-old son, and the oldest two, they're like, you know, they don't want to be having food banks. They don't want that because they're aware of it. So everything's highly visible, and that's that sense of visibility which is such a problem. Parents who use food banks experience a particular type of shame. I felt very anxious. I really felt like I'd failed as a parent to provide for my son, to look for external support. It really did feel like a total letdown as a mother. Some spoke of this pervasive feeling of guilt as a constant presence in their lives. And so when I'm talking about hunger trauma, and I'm talking about how it differs from depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, I'm talking about something that's much broader, that's imposed on people due to economic circumstances outside their control, but it's very, very complicated. And there's also problems with the many of the institutions who do food support, and however well-meaning they are. Food support organisations vary significantly. They all, I imagine, all of them start with good intentions, but they've got different structures, different processes. They give different types of food. They've got rules on what they will and won't give in terms of healthy food. Some have got eligibility criteria, policies, and a particular philosophy. Others have different eligibility criteria or none. And the amount of quality or the amount of training that people have is very limited very often, because all of the resource has to go on supporting people with food. As an example, you know, well, I guess the key take home is we all do this with good intentions, but this does not result always in good encounters. I'm going to talk about this thing, you know, sociologists talk about liminal spaces, but I think food banks act as a liminal space. A liminal space is a place in society where you transition from one way of seeing yourself to another way. Perfect example, if you go book an appointment at your doctor's, you go along to the doctor's and you'll find yourself going in as a certain person. You sit in a waiting room and you become a patient. Now, once you go into the doctor's waiting room, you're still yourself, but you're different. You're passive. You're somebody who's in with an expert. You act a certain way. You follow a certain role. Patients, the waiting rooms are liminal spaces. You change the way you are in them. And food banks and food support organisations are also liminal spaces. You go in as an independent, autonomous person and you come out as a client, as somebody who's being helped, as feeling often like a charity case. It changes the very fundamental way of seeing how you are. And charitable food support often reinforces the social and moral authority of the caregiver over the care receiver. Charity brings with it shame. As much as I mean, I've helped to run a charity for 2 years, and I don't doubt our charity's done huge amounts of good work, but the experience of using charity is shame is often implicit in people's experiences. This person talks, Sam says, oh, it's just crucifying. She said, pick what you want. So I went to pick up a pack of 4 burgers and she said, oh no, that's for families, and took it back off my hand. Well, I nearly bloody died. I was mortified. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to do this again. I'm never doing this again. And I cried all the way home from Victoria Road. And then Helen says it's the stigma. It's where do you get the voucher from? And then there's a certain element to them of trying to convert you. Helen was talking about a food bank that had been run by a religious organization. Not all religious organizations operate like this. But she said, and they pull you into their way of thinking and praying. And I bloody pray, and it's none of your business. You know, I'm not here to pray. I'm here to get the basics food. So I stopped going. So there's mixed encounters. The food bank sector is largely unregulated. This can contribute to deeply problematic overlaps between those who need and the desire to indulge in religious evangelism. As I said, not always, but it does happen. There's the issue of queuing. Some organizations, people will come to get the food and they are visibly there and visibly in public, and they are seen in this situation. I think the whole idea that you have to queue to get something so personal to you, it's not easy to ask for help. It's not easy to put your hand up. And then when you do, you're always worrying in the queue, is somebody going to drive past that you know from work, from your previous job? Is somebody going to phone my door daughter and say, I've seen your mum at the food bank queue. It's just constant. And I don't know if it's just me, it might just be me, but I just wasn't comfortable with the whole experience of it all, and I would avoid it. There are different ways of having encounters for food support. One way of doing this is having people come in, and they have benefits of that as well, because sometimes when people come in, they can get extra forms of support, or it might well be that there's a social space for people who are isolated or feeling lonely. But actually, for many people who are forced to queue for food, it's a profoundly stigmatizing experience. Most people at food banks can be visibly poor and homeless, not always, but often they can be. Research has suggested that often the people who are supporting them are very middle class. They may not be aware of users' lived experiences. It's not uncommon for support organisations to intentionally or inadvertently engage in interactions that don't dignify those who are asking for help. That is, the encounters can be experienced as undignified by the people who are using the food support organisation, but the food support organisation may not recognise that because their focus is wholly on getting that food as effectively to people as possible. But there is a space in the middle where, if it's nuanced and it's carefully protected, food support can provide dignity and it can provide a degree of stability. There are better and worse ways of doing it, I think. You can do it in a way that shows that the people who are seeking support matter. It can help you. There are practices which help to humanize people and the interactions, build trust between people, and alleviate some of this trauma. Every gesture, every conversation between those people providing and seeking support is crucial. From the moment they reach out, whether it's via telephone or email, to the moment they engage and get the food and how you deliver the food, every single encounter is important because people are so feeling such stigma, such shame, that every word that's used even is absolutely crucial. Erin says, well, no, I mean, the fact that it's delivered is absolutely wonderful because, you know, I've seen neighbours look and they just say, oh, your shopping's been delivered. And I just say yes. And, you know, that's been, if you actually go and stand there, because you see it in the news, don't you, in London, which is where I came from originally, and sometimes there's 100 people queuing. And this person, Erin, was comparing being in a queue with a delivery method that some food banks use, where they will deliver food much like a supermarket delivers food. And they won't say food bank here, or here's your, they'll just drop it off and say food delivery. Reciprocation is important as well. It's about breaking down that power imbalance between the charity and those who the persons using the charity. What people talk about is any opportunities to reciprocate for those seeking food support. Because if you don't have that opportunity, you often feel subservient rather than autonomous and empowered. I mentioned that food banks are liminal spaces. If we only have an interaction where one person gets something from somebody else, we don't allow people to have a reciprocal feeling of giving. And that's important because it improves well-being, it balances a relationship, and it fosters a kind of a relationship of social solidarity between the giver and the receiver. Well, often I give him a big bag back and say, can you just say, I'm very grateful, but I don't want them to waste. So that before I knew it, I had 40 tins of soup, you know, which I make my own soup, and we all have some crunchy bread or something. So I said, can I send this and give it to somebody else? So yeah, that's what I've done. I've just given it back rather than waste it. But then it looks like you're going, oh, no, I do not want that. What Don's kind of saying here is, you don't want to look ungrateful, but actually people will actively seek out opportunities to give, whether it's giving to other people in need, giving bags back, any opportunities that food support organisations can build in where people can have a reciprocal exchange really influences the way people experience food support. I'm going to mention, and I say this with a really profound caveat here, folks, as a man talking about gender and hunger trauma. I'm mindful of the contradiction of this, but I'm going to try and illustrate, because the reality was the majority of people who use our food bank are women. The majority of people who use food bank or who actively interact with them are women, and the majority of people who took part in this research were women. Women are, if you look at the research, are at particular risk of food insecurity. Households with children headed by single women are more likely to be food insecure. They often juggle multiple caring responsibilities, work in non-standard employment, particularly low-income part-time work. And much of women's contribution to society goes socially unrecognised and unpaid. So this gender-based division of labour renders women particularly socially insecure. And so when you talk about hunger trauma, and you can actually talk about what we call intersectionality, it's not just it's not just a gender imbalance. You can talk about the imbalance with regards to those for different social class, those of BAME ethnic minorities in this country. You know, what you find is over-representation often of people in hunger trauma. Without sufficient intervention to address those issues, there's always going to be a limited capability for women to enter political spaces and contribute to broader society. This is, of course, as I said, true of many marginalized groups. Food security is key in defending their interests against forms of structural oppression which are inbuilt in society. Again, I take this as a caveat. This part of our report was written by Hilary, because the part that I tried to write on gender, frankly, wasn't good enough. And it's really important that this is stated in an upfront way, because very often when you look at the research and you look at the way that people talk about food banks, gender is often invisibilized. So we wanted to try and make it visible in this presentation. Okay, so what do you do when we're talking about dignity? We've developed, and it may not be something that people are all on board with. They may struggle with some parts of it, but the Worthing Food Foundation delivered a food-first approach. That is, we take any kind of gatekeeping at the point of asking for food is a disproportionate response, and it can add to the shame and the fear of those seeking support and stop them getting the help they need. We believe that people seeking support should not need to apply to a third party to verify their hunger. Yes, you will lose a few tins of beans to people who might not necessarily need it, but the vast majority of people, if you are that desperate to get to a food bank, you need food. A food-first approach tries to understand the complex nature of food trauma. That doesn't just look at that, looks at the protecting social encounters, that looks at dignity, that looks at the mental distress and the crisis and the traumatic experiences, but that doesn't lose sight of the overall picture of the way in which this is economically driven and politically driven. But food stability, and it's a little bit like the housing first approach, that idea of giving people housing before, homeless people housing before you then support them with, for instance, substance abuse and mental health problems. The idea, food can be there as a method of stability. You use that as a way to build relationships and try to support people. The principles of food first: food is a basic human right. You put dignity at the heart of all encounters to reduce shame, and you have food support that must practice warmth, kindness, and solidarity. You would think maybe that this is implicit in food support, but it isn't. It values humans over bureaucracy, systems, and rules. And it's an opportunity to build relationships and try to mitigate this thing I'm talking about in terms of hunger trauma. Going back to conclusions now, poverty cannot be understood. Poverty should always be understood as a violation of human dignity and of human rights. This is a human rights issue. Hunger trauma is a human rights issue. Societal, economic, and social forces are translated into personal distress and disease. So what we talk about as mental health is actually economically and socially mediated trauma. We need to understand distress within this larger context of persistent inequality, stagnating wages, and reduced benefits in a time of rising prices. In this context, as somebody who's interested in mental health, I would never ask the question, what is wrong with you? Which is the first question you always ask when it comes to mental health. As a traditional psychologist, you have to shift the question to what has happened to you, because that's how trauma works. That's how economically mediated trauma works. Your first question has to be what happened to you, not what is wrong with you. And that's a kind of trauma-informed approach. The future, what are the things that I think we probably need? We need immediately to declare a UK-wide cost of living emergency. We've declared one locally at Worthing Borough Council, as a number of others have. But this is something that's profoundly important. We need to provide dignified support to those who need it and remove all barriers where possible to support and to provide food stability. Those who need food support should have meaningful involvement in the provision of food support. This should be addressed as a priority because there's so little user voice in food support. For me, I think mental health commissioning and food support organisations are intrinsically linked. This is a public health issue, and it's the mental health work, the trauma work that's been done by these organisations, however problematically, means that they should be considered in that realm. Hunger and malnutrition are public health and welfare concerns. They should not be charitable goods. And I think there's a broader campaign here. I mean, as much as we can try and provide dignified food support, as much as we can make broad political comments about economically mediated distress. You have to, if we're going to be serious now about addressing hunger trauma and food insecurity, we have to start talking about a right to food. We have to talking about something that is enshrined in national legislation. And I get that we don't have the political context for that right now, but campaigning and food support organisations being part of overt campaigns to campaign towards a right to food is going to be fundamentally important, because if not, we will continue to be, record numbers of people will experience this form of hunger trauma, and food support organisations will struggle, and they'll continue to struggle. And if, depending on how the next year goes, I see a huge number of food support organisations quite simply not being able to cope. So I know that people sometimes like to kind of keep the charity side but the political side apart. I think we've got to a point where you can't do that anymore. I think in order to really try and address hunger and hunger trauma, we have to be campaigning. We have to campaign for a national right to food, and that's at all levels, you know, at local authority level, county level, but also at national level. All right, folks. I'm not going to go on to the question and answer and reflections just yet. Instead, I'm just going to hold you. I've kind of tried to give a little bit about some of the political context and talk about the mental health experiences and some of the experiences of food encounters. I'm going to hand over to Pat now. Pat is a former community midwife and public health advisor, and she also does an awful lot of work with our people who use the Worthing Food Foundation. Pat's also helps to run the Worthing Food Foundation. Pat, can I hand over to you now?
Great,
Yeah.
thanks, Carl. Sorry, just Pat, before you start, Carl, if you can stop sharing your presentation, then we can all see Pat. Thank you.
I'll do that right now. Okay, I'll try to do that right now. Hopefully that's worked.
Great, Pat, go ahead.
Can everybody see and hear me? Great. Hi. Yeah, my name is Pat Schan. I volunteer with the Worthing Food Foundation as a delivery driver, but Margaret Howard, who's also on the call, we also coordinate the school uniform and shoes and winter coat project, which is also part of the Worthing Food Foundation. We also run the Broadwater Support Group, which was a support group that Margaret set up at the start of the pandemic as a community-based thing. So we work in conjunction on that. So I think Carl's alluded before that my background basically includes a long spell as a community midwife in some of the most socially deprived areas of Brighton and Hove. And latterly, at the end of my career, I was a public health specialist midwife. So this sort of work, so I've seen the detrimental effects of poverty on families and communities, and I think that's quite important, I think, to keep in mind that it does affect communities. And I'm kind of batting backwards and forwards, thinking about the various things that Carl said. And I think one of the things I've always been quite interested in my career is about those interactions with people. And in my experience, you know, that professionals or middle-class people speak differently to people that they see as not as posh as them or not as funny as them. And that's always been a real passion of mine. So I've always tried to make sure that you're speaking on the right level, using the right words and not using, but that's another issue. So I started driving quite early on in the, when the Food Foundation was set up. And I very quickly developed my own route, because as Margaret will tell you, I have to have processes. I can't do things that are at all chaotic. It really drives me mad. So I kind of developed my own route, and I picked up it's actually now a community in one part of Worthing. So it became quite natural to me to almost develop that kind of case loading, if that makes sense. It was quite a natural thing, just looking more holistically at the families and talking to them and hearing more about them. And I was thinking about what Carl was saying about the framing of the hunger trauma and the guilt and distress. And I think that one of the things that's really important, as I've just alluded to as well, is all of our interactions and encounters are so important in this picture, because you know, we go to such different houses and such different families, and such different interactions, but Carl alluded quite a lot to our delivery model. So, and I put in my notes before we even started the talk was, you know, how do you describe that delivery? How do you describe that food coming? And I always say, oh, I'm here with the shopping, you know, and I always call them up and say, you know, about the shopping and what have you. And, you know, and I was really pleased to hear that part of the research was that people really like that, you know, that they see it as something not so shameful. Because I actually did see a more traditional food bank in action a couple of years ago. I just happened to be somewhere that it was going on. And it was that whole model of a man, and he was embarrassed and ashamed, and he had to sit in a room and talk to a woman about, and she was asking him questions about what sort of things do you like to eat, and what would you do about this? What would you do? And quite like an interview almost. And then another woman went off with a trolley and came back with some food, and he kind of just went out, and the whole thing felt very embarrassing. So that's what I was going to say, those sort of interactions. So I've kind of built, you know, it's not for everybody, but it's just the way I prefer to work, is I do prefer to have that sort of more holistic attitude. And then with my background, I think I can sort of assess certain things, and, you know, I bring things to flag up things. I mean, a simple one was a couple of weeks ago, there was a message on, we have Facebook Messenger, and messages pop into that. And because I often look at it first thing in the morning, I pick them up, and Ella, one of our outgoing colleagues, there was an interaction with this woman, and our stock answers, if somebody asks for food on the Facebook Messenger, is to say, can you fill in this simple form, and then somebody will contact you, and it starts the kind of cascade. But she definitely did not want to fill that form in. And can't I tell you here? Can't I explain to you here? She didn't want to get involved in the form. She didn't want to do something. And off the messenger, Ella and I went backwards and forwards, and I said, that sends up a really big red flag to me of domestic violence. You know, if that's the only secret place she's got. So it's that sort of things, those sort of kind of interactions. But thinking about the children in these families, I mean, being poor, because I think poverty is the main thing here. And I think being poor is like putting a target on their backs, basically. You know, they have, you know, broken shoes, no coat, free school meals, you know, and anecdotally, you know, they're talking now about, you know, children stealing food from their peers and raking around in bins if they see children putting stuff in bins. And I have heard now some people who are packing extra bits in children's food boxes so that their children can share with other people. So our other hat, of course, is the uniforms, and that, you know, that can be, uniform itself can be an absolute social divider there and then. You know, if you can afford to have your name embroidered on your PE kit, you know, that's great, and stuff like that. So one of the other things that I've been doing is I've been trying to get our communities to try and swap uniforms around and change uniforms. And so I, as well as having bags of food in the car, I've always got bags of uniform as well, and coats and everything else. And my husband just looks at the bags and goes, oh, it's like a way station here, he says, and things like that. And I came across a really good thing in one of our roads in East Worthing, where they've actually set up a WhatsApp group in the road to swap uniforms. I was delighted with it. It was absolutely fantastic. So I think, I mean, I don't want to repeat a lot of what Carl said, because, you know, he knows what the experience is like of driving, of dealing with the families. And one of the other things was that I have a couple of very big families. And it's true, you see, is that they don't want tins of food. You know, if you've got 4 big lump teenagers, you know, a tin of boiled potatoes, which, you know, nobody knows anything about anymore other than our generation, you know, they want bags of vegetables and bags of chips and stuff like that they can make a meal from. You know, a couple of tins of potatoes and a Fray Bentos pie is not going to kind of cut it really with families like that. So it is about, you know, using the voucher system or being a bit more individual about what the family looks like is really helpful. I mean, the only other thing I sort of wanted to say really was, you know, Carl talked about human rights and everything else, and he did allude to about the public health crisis, and that's my other hat. I think we need to be really clear that this is a public health crisis, a complete public health crisis. You know, if you look at food poverty, then you're looking at the whole cascade of poor food choices, bad eating patterns, you know, eating whatever's around. But it's other stuff around normal family interactions are gone. People don't sit down to eat. They don't prepare food because they don't have food, or they don't have, you know, the normal thing. You know, we did some work a couple of years ago about kits for making pizzas, which went down an absolute storm. But then we realised one of my families didn't actually have any pans. They didn't have anything to cook things in, you know. So it's things like that. It's almost like a kind of a layer back from that food delivery that we give them. It never occurred to us that they may not have the actual wherewithal to cook something. And that's been people talking now about people asking, you know, not to have stuff where they'll have to use electricity and stuff like that. But it's when you lose those normal family interactions as well, you're then setting off that whole cascade of, you know, that feeling shame and embarrassment contributes to, you know, to mental health issues, as Carl's very clearly defined. And then you've got this whole cascade of poor parenting and bad behaviour at school, exclusion. There's no youth services. There's nothing that can happen about that. Poor employment prospects, and it just, that cascade goes on and on. And so, you know, it can start off with, you know, not being able to afford to get some food, but it can end up being a societal crisis. I think that's all I want to say. I hope that makes sense. Great. Very happy to take any questions. I didn't kind of want to repeat a lot of stuff that Carl was saying, but yeah, so that's
brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Pat and Carl. So now we've got some time for some question and answers. There's quite a lot of you in the room, so we can't see everybody. So what I'm going to ask people to do is either type their whole question in the chat and we'll let you unmute and ask your question, or just type question just to make sure that we definitely see you. I can see a couple of hands up already. Let me just have a look. I'll give you all a second to type question or your question in the chat. I can see Dorothy, you've got a hand up. So if you want to kick us off and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask something, because I know it's a commonplace. You see it all over the media that when children are hungry, they can't learn. But what we don't hear about is the effect it has on adults being hungry. I know research has been done in underdeveloped countries with people in extreme hunger situations. And it actually affects your ability to think, to make rational decisions, because your body, it prioritizes simply surviving. It's got no time to send blood to your brain or to spend time thinking, because all it's concerned is, I need to get this body to eat something. And I wonder if we you know, there's a lot of judgment about people who are poor and in situations of food hunger, and sort of, why don't they do this and why don't they do that? The answer is, the poorer you get, the more hungry you get, the less able you are. You just can't do it. And yet we're judging people, asking them to do something they physically can't do.
You're on mute, Carl.
Can I just come back on that, Dorothy? I absolutely agree. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly the experience, and I think that's why that when Matt, myself, Pat, and the team we're kind of trying to develop a set of principles. That idea that when people are arriving in crisis, it isn't just a crisis in terms of their mental health or the fact that they're hungry. They aren't in a position very often to be able to have the kind of focus needed in order to jump through the hoops that are often put in front of them. Take away all the shame and the indignity and all the rest. If you're in that situation, it's really hard to plan coherently when you're experiencing that. And so when I talk about food stability, this is why it's so important that we minimize every single barrier, and including the referral process. People are not in a position to go through that kind of referral process, I don't believe, when they're in that situation, which is why many will just run away from it or will not go through it in the way they should. And I think that the role of emergency food support as it is now can provide a degree of stability, not meet the need in terms of hunger, but it can provide a degree of stability where people are able to step back a little bit away from that crisis, away from that sense of not being able to concentrate on the broader picture that you're talking about, Dorothy. And it's at that point what we do. We've got one of our workers, Jackie, who 4, 5, 6 weeks down the line, we then engage with people when we believe we have a much better chance of having a conversation with them about how we might support them. But having that right up front, yes, it can be useful for those in absolute emergency, but I think actually providing some form of stability to get people to a place to be able to think straight and have those conversations and do that kind of planning is really important. So yeah, I'd agree completely with what you said.
Thanks, Carl. Pat, are you coming in with a question, or is it a comment on the answer?
Yeah, just a comment really about just following on from what Carl was saying. I think that one of the other things we have to think about is the sheer practicalities of not having the money to get to a food bank. I saw online recently about a woman who was trying to work out. I mean, we try to pick up people we see that are sending signals in some of the kind of social media groups like mums and dads and things like that. And she had worked out that she had enough money to get to the food bank in town, but she would have to walk back to Durrington or something like that. So there's all those considerations as well.
Great, thank you, Pat. So I've got a lineup of questions here. So I've got we had Dorothy, then Steph, Ruby, Jane, Matthew, Helen, and then Margaret, or Fraser, and then Margaret. So if we go to Steph first. Have we got Steph still? I can read Steph's question out if she's managed to drop off the call. So Steph's question was, first of all, brilliant talk. If food banks are effectively being institutionalized, do you think that there should be a standardization or regulation to avoid some of the issues you spoke about?
Well, I think the key my feeling, the key there is, Sarah, is not that can be a yes or a no answer, because it depends how. We know that food support organisations operate in radically different ways across the country. If you were to institute a process of regulation, which along sets of principles, which I think you could do that along sets of principles that really exacerbate this sense of trauma, or you could do it in a way that protected and supported training and made these spaces dignified and so on and so forth. So my answer would be a yes, but with a caveat, in that regulation is never the answer. It's got to be appropriate, dignified regulation that focuses on protecting encounters and providing people with stability and building relationships. So the answer is yes, but it has to be, I would say it have to be done in a certain way. And it would have to be, because in this talk, it's just this talk we're doing today is the beginning of a conversation here. I'd like this to be the start of us having that conversation about what that looks like and who needs to be involved in it and how we kind of move forward. So I've got a lot of sympathy for Steph's question, but definitely it all depends in the level of how we do it.
Great, thanks, Carl. I had Ruby next, I think, if you want to unmute yourself and read out your question.
Yeah, it was just because in Pat's talk, she said that it can be quite embarrassing for the clients having that initial conversation. So just how do you recommend having that? I try to keep it quite lighthearted, but we do have to ask a lot of questions to understand their situation, what they do and what they don't eat, and whether they have cooking facilities. So any tips on just keeping that sort of dignifying?
Do you want me to pick that up?
Yeah, go for it, Pat.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, and that's a really good question, Ruby, and I think you're right. And I think it's how you frame it, and I think that you can say things like, it is how you frame the conversation. It's about working together. Can we work together to kind of figure out what's the best stuff and stuff like that, and kind of form that partnership, so that we're not overwhelming you with tins and things, because there is also, some of the families, I know some of my families, they feel quite embarrassed to give back stuff because they think, and one of my family in the end said to me, honestly, we're just not using this stuff. I think Carl mentioned it. So I think it's about establishing a partnership. How can we work together? to get the right stuff for you, that sort of thing. That would be my opening salvo anyway, certainly, so that you're not, you can always make it, as you said, a bit light-hearted about, so that you're not overwhelmed with tins of peas pudding and things,
Yeah, it's really difficult to get the balance because we have to give standardized bags out. We can't have everyone making individual requests. It's really, really difficult to incorporate choice when you're packing bags.
Yeah, we've got Ruby. I guess there's two parts to that question. My sense is there's different phases of it. I don't think there's a one approach as to how you have that conversation. But I think if you treat the first period of contact as one of emergency, where people have very little stability and are in crisis, my sense is at that first point to try to concentrate on that core need of giving food support in the most dignified way, but being mindful that sometimes you will hear little cues where you can respond. People may say something, they may make a comment, they may say, well, I haven't got this, and then you can respond. I don't think that's the place to start to have the conversations about further support, and how we do. I think it's about being just giving the food, get people used to that practice. If there's a window there to respond to them, then respond to them. And it's after, because let's be honest, the whole term emergency food support is ridiculous. This is constant food support for people now. People are living this life. But I think after a couple of weeks, once people have started to realize that this is something they can do and it doesn't feel terribly uncomfortable, and they can have a little bit of a relationship or a conversation, you might find people then start to reach out a little bit more, or you're then able to have talked to them enough to maybe make a suggestion or two. But my feeling is, see it in phases. The first phase is just give them food, and if there is a response to be made that is brought to you, then do it. But then after a couple of weeks, do that. In terms of choice, in terms of the Worthing Food Foundation food choice, we kind of run a similar model in the sense that there are standard bags that we give, standard packages, but we also try to have people, we have a mechanism where we have a phone line, and people can contact the phone line, and sometimes they will make requests too, like I need sanitary products this week, I need extra toiletries, I need could I possibly have, and sometimes we can meet that need and sometimes we can't, but there is a mechanism there to make it slightly bespoke, as well as having this standard offer. So we try to do it as a mixture of both.
Great, thank you. I'm going to put a list of people that have asked questions in order in the chat. If you have asked a question and I haven't got your name, please message me to highlight the fact that I've missed you. So next we had Jane, I think it was.
I forgot what my question was. Yeah, I mean, food pantries are slightly different, where people do get a choice of what they pick, and quite often people get passed on from the food bank, the emergency, onto that, so people can go every week. We have quite a lot, I'm in Chichester, we have quite a lot of pop-up pantries, which cause a lot of queues. So people queue up half an hour before, they come. And when you were talking about queuing, how do we get over that problem of the queuing?
Well, the thing is, for me, Jen, it's kind of tricky now, because there's a number of, I think pop-up pantries are fantastic. I think community supermarkets, community pantries are fantastic. Matt and I went and visited the one in Peacehaven with Steph the other day, and these are really important contributions to emergency food support. The tricky thing now is, what we do at the Worthing Food Foundation as a food bank is that we never have people come to the building. Nobody ever comes. We have delivery drivers. So we have, there's 2 delivery days, and drivers come and pick up. We pack the bags, and they are taken much like you would take a Sainsbury's shop. You drop it at the door, say your food's here, and you go. Now, that's, as a food bank, we can operate that model, and it works. As a pantry, it's trickier, because the pantry model can provide elements of dignity that the food banks can't, such as choice, people being able to choose what they want, which is absolutely really fundamentally important. Also, it provides the opportunity for people to contribute financially, whether that's like £4 a month or £4 for and getting £25 worth of food, or whatever model it works. It's that reciprocal exchange again. And so pantries do so much, but the problem we've got now is the need is so overwhelming. so overwhelming that pantries find it harder and harder to operate without having that queuing system. And so I don't think there's an easy answer to how you would operate a pantry without the queuing system. Obviously, you can try and open it more often, you can try and schedule people, but the scale of need is so huge. And this is why at the end of the talk, I was talking about the fact that we have to broaden this conversation now. This can't just be a conversation among the emergency food support organisations like food banks and pantries. You know, we really do have to start putting concerted pressure as a sector on whatever government of the day it is, and say, look, right, the only way you're going to stop this is enshrining right to food with proper economic support for people who are working and not working, because otherwise those queues are going to continue to build up outside pantries. So I'm sorry that that's not necessarily a clear answer to that question, but I just believe that in order to address the overwhelming need, we need a broader kind of campaign, I think, or more people to be involved in that campaign.
Yeah, and I think the other point I was making was that we need to have people within the food banks or the food pantries to give advice on benefits, you know, not to make everybody talk to that person, but to have somebody there. So if they need to speak to someone, because so many people don't claim all the benefits they're entitled to. I mean, early start vouchers are an example, for instance. I think the take up has not been good, and yet so many people are actually entitled to them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I definitely, where that's possible, Jane, I agree. We have, like I said, we've got somebody called Jackie who does exactly that. After 3 or 4 weeks, she contacts families and if they want to, she has a conversation about the different things that are available, and she's linked people in with huge amounts of support. It's fundamentally important.
Great, thank you. So next we had Matthew Potter.
Hello, thanks, Carl. I enjoyed that. So my name is Matthew. I'm from the Worthing Food Foundation as well. I was just looking at the questions that were in the thing. One of them was about the sort of prescriptive nature of food parcels, and I thought I'd answer that one. And how do you balance food allergies? And the answer to that is that we give vouchers to people. There are a few people that we give specific foods to. If they can't get out or they have problems, we will shop specifically for them. But in general, we will give them vouchers, and vouchers are an interesting thing. So we've always wanted to give people vouchers because there's a lot less waste. It's easier from our point of view. There's a lot less waste, and there's choice and dignity in being able to go, and socialization and being able to go to the shops and choose what you want to eat rather than having to eat what someone else did. Now, if you go back a year or so, that was almost impossible to do because funders do not like the idea of giving people money, because you fall into the old, they'll spend it on drink, drugs, widescreen TVs, all that kind of stuff thing. But what's happened recently has forced us to do it. We simply cannot cope with the sheer number of people coming through the doors. So this week, I have 30 different families. I've just been doing it. I've got 30 new families come through the door. That's another £1,000 this week in food going out that we're going to have to send out in voucher form. So we have to use vouchers now in order to cope with the numbers, which I think is a good thing. Now, a couple of things that came up for me was in your talk, Carl, was one was that even within, there's a very short term, to me, there's a very short term view of the effects of food banking. And I think that we don't look at the fact that that food poverty is giving people forms of PTSD that will last a lifetime for them. Carl and I had spent an afternoon with someone who's now my age nearly. She's highly successful businesswoman, this and the other, but she was brought up in absolute food poverty, and the trauma of that she is still suffering from really badly. I mean, it was dramatic. It was quite a dramatic afternoon spent with her, opening up. And we don't talk about the long-term effects that this is going to have on people. It is not cured by giving people food. It's not cured by people being elevated out of food poverty. You know, it will last for a long time, and it will last for their lives, and we don't really take it that seriously, and I think we should be. And I think the other thing that we should be talking about is we actually deal in the food banks with only a very small percentage of people. We're dealing with kind of the lucky ones, the ones that are getting food. There are many more times more people who simply aren't getting any of that. We should, I think it's beholden us as food banks, and we are trying to do this in different ways to reach out and find those people, because they'll be suffering even more. So those are the two things really, the sort of longevity of the effects of this, and the fact that we're not really touching the sides of the problem yet.
Yeah, I agree with Matt. Just to kind of follow up, if you take a town like Worthing, you've got an organisation like the Food Foundation might support 500 people, but if the statistics say that 12,000 people are living in food insecurity, it gives you a sense of what is scale of need is not being met.
Thank you, Matt. Some really good points there. I had Helen next. Have we still got Helen?
Sorry, I'm on the school run, so it's taking
no
me a bit
worries.
of time to coordinate everything. If somebody could read it out for me, it was more a point than a question, but it's kind of like a question. It's kind of, how do we deal with that issue?
So let me see if I can find it. Okay, so Helen, my experience is that clients rely on cheap food that don't require lots of money to cook, which mean they can't afford fresh fruit and veg or to cook oven meals.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, and sorry, thank you. My background is that we both run a community fridge that has lots of fresh produce, but often that requires cooking. But also I provide debt counselling, and those clients often are relying on kind of cheap and nasty, ultra processed, and just, you know, a lot of them might know how to cook, but don't have the time or the money to be able to buy the decent ingredients or cook them properly.
yeah, I mean, Helen, I'd agree. And by the way, folks, I know I'm sitting, you know, Pat and I gave the talk, but I'm mindful there's a lot of people on here with an awful lot of experience here. So if you want to chip in, please do. It just, you know, put your hands up or indicate you want to speak, because I'm sure you'll have as interesting responses as anybody else. Helen, I mean, I think I agree. The tricky thing, what we found with the Food Foundation very early, was we made a decision that we weren't going to be prescriptive about what people ate. So because it's so varied. However, we wanted to give people the choice where possible to give them fresh food. So we give fruit and veg out, and obviously now we give vouchers out where people can spend it on fresh fruit and veg. That doesn't address the issue where people aren't able to do that, but certainly it's an option for people who want it, and we always put it in there. But there are many people who don't, and there can be a kind of a sense of nutritional evangelism around some food banks. Or we can't give them this shit, we can't give them pot noodles, we can't give them all this. But in actual fact, the reality for us is that some of the people, some of the organizations, one of the organizations we support, a local organization that supports street homeless people, and they regularly request those types of food. They say, this is what we want. Yes, they will want cereals, they will want tinned food, but they specifically want that food. We're not going to, I don't think it's useful for us to not serve that need. If people ask for that, then we will give them that. It's not our place to try and judge what people should eat. But where possible, we do always give the option of fresh fruit and veg. Yeah, but I know that that's not something that everybody's able to do, because it's not easy with fresh food. You know, we can store food at our food bank for a long time, tinned processed food. With fresh fruit and veg, we have to do a huge amount of work to bring that in on the day and get it out on the day. It takes a lot of organising from people behind the scenes, picking up in the morning from the food wholesalers. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's worthwhile in terms of giving people nutritious food.
Thank you, Carl. I think I had Fraser next, but I'm not sure he's still on the call.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, brilliant. There we go.
Yeah, I have thanks to kind of everybody, and kind of the speakers and everybody else kind of chipping in. My question is really kind of, how do we reframe this kind of issue I know kind of historically food banks have been sort of charitable and linked to churches and etc. And I think Carl was alluding that really, yeah, this is a public health issue and a welfare issue. I've seen kind of overseas kind of food insecurity, and yeah, that's lifelong effects on especially the children, their development. So if we're moving to a stage where kind of children are going to be in food poverty, that never mind PTSD of it all, but it is going to kind of impact their long-term development. So how do we reframe this? And yeah, this is a political issue. I have reducing income tax and cutting kind of caps on bankers' things is not going to deal with the issue that we're looking at here. I also understand that universal credit is going to be more scrutinized, whatever that means. So I have really, yeah, how do we build that sort of broad alliance? I have not just political parties, but bringing in kind of healthcare workers and maybe teachers and all sorts of things to really push this one up the agenda and reframe it as a pretty major public health crisis that is beginning to loom along with others.
Yeah, thanks very much, Fraser. I think that's a really good question, because I think there's a lot of things around emergency food that needs to be reframed, to be honest. But the public health aspect is absolutely important. I think the way you reframe it is you have to create spaces to start having that reframed conversation, and you have to, as Fraser said himself, you have to have those different people involved in those spaces. On November the 12th, Saturday, November the 12th in Worthing, we're holding a national right to food event at the Assembly Rooms, and I'll ask Sarah to distribute the information around to everybody over the next week. And that's exactly what we're going to try and do, Fraser. We're going to try and invite those multiple different stakeholders to coalesce around how we start to have a conversation about reframing emergency food, who that conversation needs to be pointed at, how we build a broad coalition that takes into consideration, because there's great stuff. If you look at people like Ian Byrne in Liverpool with his Right to Food campaign, if you look at the Right to Food London campaign, if you look at the fans supporting food banks, there's a lot of really good work going on. But for us, I think the key thing is creating those spaces to have conversations with the broad stakeholders, and then starting to try and create a movement that brings all the other stakeholders in around that reframing. I just don't think it's something we can do on our own. And so our attempt as a local kind of group who are interested in food insecurity, we're going to host this event in Worthing on November 12th. So I mean, please do put it in your diary. Come along. We'll try and make it so it's online, it's a hybrid, so people can come can be a part of it without necessarily coming. But yeah, I think the short answer is it will not happen unless we build a coalition and create spaces to have these conversations.
Great. Thanks for that. One thing that I'm picking up on kind of in the chat line is that somebody was saying that in Scotland they've just finished a consultation on removing food banks. That report, I'm sure, will be kind of interesting reading then. Yeah, what do you replace the food banks with, or what is proposed? I wonder whoever said that, kind of how do we get hold of the report when it's published?
I don't, Fraser, I don't know about that. I mean, maybe I'll ask Sarah if she's heard of that. I haven't heard of the report, but I'd certainly be interested in reading it.
Yeah, I think it was our Slater, maybe Ruth, put that in the chat. I mean, it does seem like Scotland sometimes are streets ahead of us most of the time. Thank you for that, Fraser. So we've got Margaret's got a question next.
Mine was more of a answering Ruby, I think it was, talking about how do we make that first contact better. And I can just talk about what we do at Worthing Food Foundation is there's no stigma, there's no limit. All they have to do is phone up or speak to one of us and say that they need help. We literally take their name and address, and depending on how the conversation is, and say, well, yes, we can deliver to you on Wednesday or Friday. And there's no, are you going to get it? What's the questions I've got to go? What's the hoops I've got to go through? It's literally, you say that you need it. I know some food banks have to have vouchers, or they have to go citizens' advice. And I don't think we should regulate it, because that will make even more trouble. But I do think making that first interaction just about what do you need and this is how we'll get it to you, that's the most important thing, I think. The other thing I wanted to talk about is heating. Funnily enough, I was driving past somewhere and saw these colour gas heater type things on the pavement. Somebody was selling the colour gas. And what's going to happen now this winter, people are going to start buying that to heat their homes, and they're going to be full of condensation and mould inside their properties because they're not going to have any dry heat. You know, so it goes from food to uniforms to clothes, and then it goes on to heating, you know, and the shame that a lot of people feel, it's really, really important that we build up relationships and we take away the stigma as much as we can. You know, we're even finding now we're having people that have come out of prison, and I'm not really understanding what's happening here, where they will go to a local food bank, because surely there's systems in places so that they have some food when they get outside. It's getting worse and worse, and I'm really quite concerned for the future, to be quite honest, because the food banks are needing the money. It's not distributed evenly amongst the food banks either, and and there's more and more children going to school hungry and have stunted physical and emotional and developmental because they aren't getting sufficient food, and families are too ashamed and embarrassed to say. That's all I really wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Some really good points there. Do you want to come back on any of that, Carl or Pat?
I mean, yeah, I mean, sorry, just to say, I mean, we all know that schools are feeding children now. There's breakfast clubs and after school clubs. And, you know, Carl and I went to one of the local schools last year to talk about, to talk about their work and our work. And this is all voluntary, you know, teachers are going in at 10:30 and doing rounds of toast when the children arrive and stuff like that, you know. I mean, it's bananas. It's absolutely bananas.
Thank you. Just before we go on to the next question, I'll highlight that in the chat, Lee put down the link to that Scotland consultation, and we can circulate that link after as well, so everybody's got a copy of it. So our next question was from Leona.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks, Carl. That was, and Pat, that was really, really good presentation that you gave. Really appreciate that. Although it was really hard to hear some of those facts and figures, it's quite distressing when you work with people day in, day out, and you know they're suffering from this. It's quite hard. I just wanted to ask, it's similar along the lines of what Helen was saying actually about you know, the quality of food and the type of foods that people are getting. And if there's plans for a community fridge. I know that's really difficult. I think Christina was, I spoke to Christina a while ago about that, so there might be plans for that to come up, but it's just the worry for me about the types of food that people are able to have. We all know the link between food and mood and how good food can boost good mental health. There's also people with long-term health conditions like diabetes and disabled people with the foods that they need to eat. I just sort of wondered with the quality of food that people are getting, if that's, I know that's a difficult thing, but you know, are there any plans for sort of fridges and larders and things locally?
Yeah, I mean, Leona, just with regards to Worthing, I mean, we've just, I'll chuck my political hat on here. We've just declared a cost of living emergency, and part of that is allocating money, and we're in the process, hopefully, of also allocating space to engage. So we're going to start we're going to ask Adur Worthing Food Network to write our food poverty action plan, which we'll see what comes out of that in terms of the recommendations. But I know that from initial conversations, we're actively seeking to set up a community supermarket stroke pantry. And I think also ideally to set up some sort of community cooking facility as well, that we can link up to hubs and create some really kind of decent quality food that we can distribute throughout the town. It's going to take time. It's not an easy thing for sure. And so our resource at the moment is on trying to sustain some of the local food support organisations. But yes, the plan is very much there, and the conversations are happening to try to make that happen. Yeah, I can see Christina's here, guys, from the Worthing Soup Kitchen. So I'll hand over to Christina, because I imagine she's got something to say on this. Over to you, Christina.
Yeah. Thank you, Carl. Hi, Leonora. It's lovely to meet you. And yes, to go back to the community fridge, we have secured that for our premises. As Carl's just said, things take a lot longer than one expects, and we've encountered one after another. Hopefully it will not be able to access, and hopefully we'll be able to make meals. So it'll just be like a little pilot scheme, trying it out and see how we get along. But I'd like to revert back to the earlier conversation of children, which is a massive issue. We're working mainly in the Darrington area. We see food poverty first, and no one is happy about going to school hungry, and there are certain services in place. I'd like to see school meals free across the whole of the board, so that there's no discrimination from one child to the next, because I think there's a lot of not rivalry, but children picked on, oh well, you've got free school meals, you've got the ticket. Or what they did in the States was appalling, with the numbers on their hands and kids going back with notes because mum and dad hadn't been able to afford school meals. It would be a lovely way of resolving the issue, at least Monday to Friday during the week, if that was free and to every child at school, and then there'd be a lot of peace of mind for the community. But again, that would have to be done from central government to sort of roll that out. But I think it will resolve, and at least we'd know that children were having at least one hot meal a day, if nothing else. So that was my point. I don't know if anybody's got any questions. Or
Thanks, Christina. Does anybody want to come back on that? Cool, thank you, Christina. And I think yourselves are looking at getting the community fridge, and Christina's got an amazing new cafe. If anybody is in Worthing, it'll be open in the next couple of months with Worthing Soup Kitchen. So we had Tejal next.
Hi, hope you can see me as well. I just wanted, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who's doing all this amazing work. I'm Tejal Lovelock. I work for Bucks Healthcare Trust. I'm in the NHS, and we're looking at how we can support people, mainly our staff group, but people who are coming in through A&E and various patients. And one of the questions that I've got is understanding how many organisations are putting into place limits on the amount of help that they can give. So when we're signposting or able to sort of help support people, we're not increasing their anxiety of that they're going to be limited in the amount of support that they can get from one particular service. So I just wanted to understand a little bit more about the limits that people are having to put into place at the moment. And we've got winter pressures coming up, you see, so there's going to be many more people who are going to be in need. So we're sort of trying to work out how do we have that conversation with our partners in the local authority around that.
Yeah, Tejal, I think it's a really good point. I mean, it's something, if we go back to the kind of the statistics and figures I gave at the beginning of the talk about the sheer numbers of food banks that are now struggling to and reducing their offer and or struggling to source food. I think as time goes forward, I think we're going to see this become more and more of an issue where organisations that refer don't necessarily have the confidence to know that they are referring into some other organisation that can support them. I think the only way to try and address that is through communication and partnership. It's what we've tried to do when we're with the Worthing Food Foundation is build links with the local hospital, build links with Guild Care, with local community organisations, with CAB, with anybody who might think about referring, so we can keep a conversation about how we're doing and what we're able to respond to. But I think the only way, Tejal, to manage that is to build some way in a locality to communicate together about what that need looks like and who's able to meet it. Because otherwise, undoubtedly, I think people will be referred, and I don't doubt it's happening already to certain places, and the need will not be able to be met. So yeah, I mean, I think just having a space to communicate as to how, and also it's really useful to make this public and visible. If referrals are going, if referrals are coming from an NHS trust or from CAB or from somewhere else, and there's no support organisation there that's able to pick up the slack for whatever reason, it's really useful to have some sort of group in a locality who can make that visible and say, do you know what, we've reached capacity here. I'm going to turn this back over to the county council, to the local authority, to the media, and say, this is it. We have to. It's really important to make this visible, because if you don't make it visible, nothing will get done. And I think the key element to try and bringing about some sort of change locally and nationally is really making this failure and inadequacy to meet the need as visible in public as possible. So I would say good communication between partners to make sure that the referral process is working, and when it is overwhelmed, be public.
Yeah, and I was going to add a comment in there. I think it's often easier said than done with so many different organisations with different lengths of funding time. And I know what we did recently was looked at only the statutory support that was available to people in Adur and Worthing locally. And there were over 60 different methods of support, and how people are finding the route into that and out of that and in between organisations is, I think, the next piece of work that Carl's going to be looking at. So I had a question next from Karen, but I think it was directly about to do with a paper. Do you have a reference on gender, nature, food insecurity? So Karen, maybe if you can just pop your email in the chat, I can link you and Carl up directly after, so Carl can send you that information over.
There is, Karen, just we've written the report and we've not circulated it yet, but there's a report that's been written on this piece of work, which got finished yesterday. And I know that Sarah and Jess are going to send it around to all the people who...
Sorry, Carl, I've just come back from the school run. So just this minute, was you responding to me?
Yeah, I was responding to you. I was just saying we've just literally finished the report today, and we're going to send the report out to all the people who are here. And what it has, the section, a much more developed section on gender and hunger trauma, but it also has a reference list where there's a number of relevant references that you can kind of follow up for further reading on how this is experienced and the implications. So it's all in there.
Great, wonderful. And did you pick up on the other question? Have you answered that already, or have I?
I'm not sure what the other one was. I can't see the chat, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. The other question was, how would, I mean, this could be like a collective hive response, but something that I've noted that's been put in a local authority cost of living crisis response is this notion around preventing food tourism. Una, get out of the space, please. No, just wait a minute. Food bank tourism. This obsessive idea that people are fraudulently going around just collecting food from everywhere. So I just want something more robust to come back with an argument about that. I mean, obviously, what you've detailed today is really powerful in terms of. Una, stop it. Sorry.
That's all right.
You know, and I'd love to sit them all down and give, you know, and for them to kind of hear this presentation. Yeah, so I'm thinking about rebuttals for that, really, if anybody's got ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a long history of public ideas about the deserving and the undeserving.
Undeserving, yeah.
You know, it's unfortunately it's littered through every conversation about poverty and for generations. Very
stubborn narrative, isn't it? To shift.
It's an incredibly stubborn narrative, but like all these public narratives, it serves a function. It allows people to hold a certain set of values and beliefs that or to invisibilize or not have to deal with what they are seeing in the world around them. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't, off the top of my head, I can't say that I know necessarily that I've got statistics on the amount of supposed food bank tourism that happens. However, I mean, I'd like to think that there are some out there. I'll certainly try and look it up, Karen. One
of the things I've just thought of as you were speaking is because a lot of community food aid people don't collect stats and information. It kind of makes that argument more permissible, doesn't it? Because you don't know ultimately, and
no, you don't.
But people don't actually know the full extent of food insecurity levels. I mean, I found, and I don't know if people are aware, but that they've issued a paper called time to measure, and what they're wanting to do is to bring together.
Oh, I think we've just lost Karen somehow. I think Matthew, you had a hand come in on that point. Unfortunately, Karen might not hear it, but she can catch up in the chat or in the recording.
It's a very valid point. I mean, I take that one head on. I just say yes. You know, there may well be a few people getting more tins of beans than they deserve, in inverted commas. But if you're looking at the type of food response that you want, and it's a kind of trauma informed one, which is what we're hoping to do, and you're not going to put the barriers in the way of people, then it's effectively a loss leader. So maybe it does cost us an extra. I mean, it's a lot less than anyone ever thinks, but maybe it does cost you another 5%.
And also,
but that 5% means that we are getting to a lot more people. We're getting a lot more people through the door because we're not throwing up the barriers that perhaps more traditional food banks do. And if you look at the use of food banks in Worthing, which is the only area I can really know about, that's borne out. You see how many more people feel able to use our food bank than food banks that put barriers in people's way. And if it costs us an extra 5% to reach those people, then it's 5% well worth spending.
Thank you, Matthew. I had Brian next on the questions. I can see you keenly putting your hand up there, Brian. So I think you've got a point on this point as well, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we have a policy at our place, and we've advocated this at all the meetings we've been to. Like, as long as they're not sending their extra tin of beans to the Cayman Islands, then they can have it. You know, so that's the policy we have in place. I mean, people make more checks on people getting a tin of beans from a food bank than they do on tax payments at the moment. But that's another story. But talking of which, I know everyone's doing a great job, but it really does feel like we're just tinkering around the edges here. I feel like someone's had their throat cut and I'm giving them a plaster. And, you know, the basic minimum safety net from the welfare state has been taken away and it needs to be replaced. As simple as that. And I know there's a few Labour councillors on this meeting wearing different hats, but has even the Labour Party got a policy to abolish food banks? Does anyone know? I mean, that would be a good start, to just abolish them for starters and raise the minimum safety net so people don't need them.
Yeah, Brian, let me respond to that on both your points as somebody who helps to run a food organisation and a Labour politician. First of all, I agree completely about what you're saying about the beat. Look, the reality is, if people are going to multiple food banks, they need to go to multiple food banks. That's simple as that. They're hungry, and if they go to your food bank and they ask for it, that's what today's talk's about. What it takes to expose yourself like that to get food. You know, people just don't do that if they don't need it. It's as simple as that. And so we operate a similar policy to you. We just, if people say they're hungry, we give it to them. That's it. In terms of the Labour Party, you're absolutely right. As I said when I was talking about earlier on, this is all economically mediated. It's all produced by the fact that people haven't got enough income to meet the costs. Have the Labour Party nationally got a strategy in place that's satisfactory to do that? No. No way, not at all. And so for us, for those of us who realise that needs to happen, that much more radical change needs to happen, we have to make that argument in those spaces. So we got the annual conference this coming up this weekend. I'm just going to leave for it in about an hour's time. Our CLP put a right to food motion through, as with a whole bunch of other CLPs, to try to get this enshrined into the manifesto of the Labour Party. Don't get me wrong, this is a long battle, but I won't get bogged down in the internal manifestations or arguments in the Labour Party. Suffice to say, there are a lot of us who are pushing for this, because at the moment it isn't there.
Well, good luck at conference this weekend, mate. I hope you get it. I hope you get a motion put on there, because it needs, the Labour Party really needs. It's a morally. You know, the food bank shouldn't even be in place. So, I mean, we've got to have at least one political party that wants to see the back of them.
Yeah,
so agreed. Good luck with that one. All right.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Kate, and then we've got Bruce, and then there was a comment from Mary about sharing, and then I think we'll finish off with Neil, because that'll probably take us to time. Neil, I know you're before, but I think you've got a good question to end on. So Kate, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. I'm a councillor over in Brighton and Hove. And 2 years ago, actually, this week, founded the Molescombe Community Market, which is a social supermarket, for all the reasons that Carl so eloquently described at the beginning. Because having volunteered at a food bank, I was horrified at the response and how people reacted to it. So I'm here to really push for the social supermarket model. I can't do anything about the queues, Carl. It's not very desirable, but actually our queues are now pretty sociable places where people know everybody by, people are talking to people they wouldn't normally talk to. So we do everything we can. We call people members and we talk about shopping, and people shop for what they want. And that then you don't have to have that tricky conversation that Ruby was talking about, like, what are your dietary requirements? What do you need? Because people know what their dietary requirements are, and they know what they need, and it's not much to ask to choose what you want. And I've always made the point that, it's very true what you say about middle-class people. Middle-class people eat chickpeas and porridge, but that's because they choose to, and they don't have the right to choose for everybody else. So we became inundated when the universal credit uplift got taken away, and we asked our members if we could move to fortnightly, and not a single person complained, because they all had friends that were on the waiting list and they were quite happy to shop fortnightly. So that is one way you can get around it. We've got some great we weight the foods that we think people want to buy. So 3 portions of any fruit or veg will only count as one of your choices. We now get discounted cheese that we sell, and we always have eggs. So we try really, really hard to offer people healthy food, but that doesn't necessarily stop people diving for the crisps. So, it's a model that really works. We were so nervous when we started it. And one of the things that I've said all along is that there's no point people reinventing the wheel. And one of the things I would really like to do is to get together outside of the city with people to sit down and say, here's a toolkit. Here, this is where you start. It's not as daunting as you think it's going to be. These are the policies, these are model policies. This is where you get your public liability insurance. This is all the, there's loads of knowledge out there that we can share. But it's very much, it's so important that it's of the community, and what we have now is people saying, oh, you look busy. I've got an hour. Can I stop and help for an hour? We go, yes, please. So we have members that stop and help. And then it doesn't feel like, it doesn't feel like a charity. I really wanted to move away from the charity feel, like, oh, I'm ever so grateful, I'm ever so humble. And there's still elements of that around, but not in our community supermarket, and we welcome everybody, and we always say to people, we do take referrals, and anybody can ask for the first 4 to 6 weeks free. That's fine. We say, that's fine. We understand it's really hard, but come the end of the month, you've got 4 weeks to save up the £3.50 you're going to need to shop. And we don't think that's unreasonable, and neither do the people. Quite often people will pay a little bit extra. And I know that Rachel's on here. She runs Brightstorm, very, very, very similar lines, except she's a community supermarket magnate. She's got a chain of supermarkets, and I've just got one. But so I'm happy to help anybody set up a community supermarket, because I really do think they are the way forward, although they shouldn't be necessary again. But you start with compassion and love and friendship for people, and you get their trust that way, and they will tell you what they want to tell you. They don't have to tell you anything if they don't want to. That's what the only thing you have to do is live in the ward, nothing else. We ask no other questions. Nobody asks you anything when you walk into Aldi, and that's how we feel it should be with us. You will share your private, personal worries and trials and tribulations when you're ready to, and we'll be ready to hear you. And I know, Pat, because I used to work in probation in Worthing for years, and I'm sure we've worked on cases before, but it's really nice to see so many people taking interest. I'm really sorry I was late.
No problem, Kate. Thank you. I agree with everything you've said, actually, and it's something we're really desperately keen to get set up in Worthing. So I think I will come your way for a bit of advice. Like we went and saw Steph in Peacehaven. That was incredibly helpful. So I will be in touch.
Can I just say one more thing that hasn't been mentioned? That we've got a project in Brighton, which is about hygiene poverty, which is something else people don't talk about. And there's a community laundrette that you can book a slot and you can go in and you can do your washing and you can have a cup of coffee and do a bit of art and craft at the site, because it's Brighton, you've got to be doing art and craft. But importantly, you can get it dry and take it home. So, you know, that's something I think that the other thing that we really need to look at when we're talking about children being stigmatized at school, those children who don't get their uniforms washed or whose personal hygiene isn't up to scratch, that's massive for children, absolutely massive.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Kate. Would you mind, if you can find a link to it, would you mind popping it in the chat, and then we can circulate that project again after, and then maybe I can circulate your email as well if you're happy for people to contact you about community pantries. Thank you. So Bruce, you've been patiently waiting.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everybody for this very interesting talk with lots of contributions. Been very interesting. Just a general question really about how people with disabilities are being catered for in, because I do have a disability, but it's a fairly minor one, and I appreciate that the range of disabilities is very difficult to cater for everybody. But I mean, I saw some time ago the picture of the crate of nice fresh food, and I thought, what on earth would I do with that? Because I've only got the use of one hand, and I couldn't pick up the crate if it were delivered to me. B, my dog would eat it first.
Matt, are you still on the call?
I am, yeah.
Are you okay to respond to that? I think you're probably in the best position, mate.
I am. So in terms of what would we provide, we would be as accommodating as possible. So we've got various people with whom we provide specialist diets or things or things that are easy for them. They can manage to cook, or they can this, that, and the other. We are incredibly kind of as responsive as we possibly can be. In terms of the physical thing, so I can say there's one guy that I deliver to in Shoreham, and I've put, with his help, because he's got very bad back, so we put hooks around his kitchen and actually some hooks outside for if he's not there, so that I can hang bags so that he can reach them without having to bend down, and that we only pack the bags to a certain level so that they're carryable. But in general, we'll go in and unpack for him. So the answer to your question is we are as responsive as is possible. Yeah, there's a thing there about softer foods. We definitely do that. We provide softer foods to some people. We are as responsive as possible, but it is dependent on developing a relationship in which people are happy to tell you about what their needs are. So what I find is quite often that doesn't happen immediately. So what I tend to find is, because I do most of the communication with people, what I tend to find is that after a period of, comparatively short period of time, generally, people will begin to open up and ask for things or tell me what problems they have and this, that, and the other. So the answer to that is we are as responsive as possible, both in how we deliver and what we deliver. But it is dependent on people. We are dependent on the relationship we have with people and people being comfortable enough to tell us.
That's absolutely superb. You said the magic phrase to me, which is developing relationships. It's all about developing relationships and trying to sort of work out situation. I mean, quite a lot of disabled people don't actually know what their difficulties are when it comes to food. I mean, I can open certain tins and not other tins.
Yeah.
because I can't use a tin opener, but I can do those ones with a pull top. I can get those up somehow.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we've also done, Pat touched on this as well, is that we have, when we become aware of a need that's not food, so which may be an electric tin opener would be a good example of that. If we become aware of that, then we will provide it. We don't just limit us, you know, it's pointless giving people food if they don't have a saucepan to cook it off or a plate to eat it with, or they can't open the tin. So when again, that depends on developing the relationship with someone until they're comfortable to tell you that.
Yeah, that is superb, absolutely superb. Just a sort of follow-up observation of, I don't know how aware people are of the situation with the Department of Work and Pensions processing PIP applications. Basically, they've just stopped processing PIP applications for 5 to 12 months. They are about to probably start again soon, and that could affect very much how people their income. Whilst they've been suspended, they've been carrying on paying what they were last allocated, but that could be about to change, because they want, as soon as they hit processing them all, I mean, you could get very different responses, and people's change of circumstances hitting them instantly, very quickly, and that could be a real sort of lead to a real charge, if you like.
Thank you, Bruce. Excellent question and really good point, and something we should all definitely be keeping an eye on. Thank you for raising that. So we've got a question from Mary and then a final one from Neil, and then we'll finish off if that's okay. So we'll go slightly 5 minutes over, but I think a couple of good questions that are worth hearing and hearing the answers to. So Mary, do you want to ask your question?
Hi there. Yes, thanks for a great seminar. Fantastic. Thanks everyone for your contributions. I just had a kind of question comment, just to say there's been talk on this seminar sort of creating alliances between food organisations and the value of that dialogue and collective action. I think collaboration and partnership between food organisations is a great idea, but what I've seen is that the funding environment can mean that groups who are funded can be disincentivized to support capacity building of grassroots organizations. And that in a place-based way, that means that certain places don't get the support they need. And where organizations are funded by local authority, they can be disincentivized from speaking out about those gaps in provision. And it can collectively just have the effect of sort of silencing certain groups and certain issues, so that it ends up taking a lot of courage and determination for groups to speak out on issues, because they risk never being funded. And I think that's a real tension that I've seen locally. And I just wondered if people had any thoughts on how you disrupt that kind of environment, make it more positive.
I'll respond to that. Mary and I have a history of working on projects a little bit like, guys, sorry, if you haven't muted, could you mute yourselves? Is that all right? I'm hearing some feedback. But I think Mary and I worked on a project a few years ago where we were in a situation where we worked with the community and voluntary sector organisation in Brighton, and it was basically we were looking at protecting the encounters that that charities and local community groups had with people, often very vulnerable people, from data overload at the time, you know, because people were having given funding streams from different funders, and they were all wanting evaluations, and so people would be asked to give people before questions, after questionnaires which were really insensitive, asking really personal questions. And what that was doing is it was making the difficult for these organizations to have sensitive, dignified encounters. And so it strikes me that there's an analogy between what we were trying to do, Mary and I, back then, and what maybe needs to happen now, which is first of all, creating spaces where you bring those organizations together. What we did about a few years ago was we brought spaces where we had Community Works, who were the infrastructure organization. We had Brighton and Hove Council involved. We had different funders involved, and we had a lot of the charities involved themselves. And we worked together to build a position statement that articulated some of these problems and trying to reduce this data burden and the impact that it was having. And so I think locally, it's not easy, because I agree with what Mary's saying. I think that people are disincentivized through the fear of losing funding by speaking out in an overtly political way. But I think you can also create spaces where you bring all those stakeholders together and at least try to have that conversation in numbers. And the key is it has to be had in numbers. The success or failure of Mary's and I's work a few years ago was the fact that we had an awful lot of organizations. I think it was 64 organizations involved. And I think it's in numbers you can do it. On your own, it makes it much more difficult. And then second part to that is probably to really try and utilize organizations like IFAN, the Independent Food Aid Network, because they are really linked in to a lot of different food banks, and they have a platform to have those sorts of conversations at a different level. So for me, it's kind of two approaches, but I recognize the tension that Mary's talking about.
Great, thank you, Mary. Really good point. There's a quick comment from Hannah that I'll just highlight, that Buckinghamshire are looking to develop a plan over the next coming months, which is brilliant news. So it'd be brilliant if anybody in the group would be willing to share any example of food access and food poverty plans if they have developed. If anybody does have any and want to send them to me, I can make sure they're circulated. Also worth highlighting that Food Power, which was run by Sustain, have a list of food poverty strategy plans that have been developed over the last number of years, and Sustainable Food Places. Sustainable Food Places also have a Rise Up list that is national. So if you're not on that and are interested in reaching out to other food partnerships, I can put the email address for that in the chat. So finally, we'll go to Neil, who I think had a very good question to sum up. Hopefully you're still here, Neil. If not, I can say, Neil, there we go. I think you're there. I don't know if he's not on mute, but I can't hear anything. So what I'll ask his question for him. So Neil said, this research is incredibly powerful and presents a much needed narrative at a time when food and food support have become increasingly important topics. Is there a strategy to share this as widely as possible and continue this conversation?
Oh gosh, that's a very good point, Neil. No, there isn't, but there will be. Definitely. I think for us, we wanted to kind of test this out and sense check it with people who are involved in food support and get a sense of what people thought and whether they recognize some of the things we're saying. I think from this point, we will sit down as the Adur inferred, the Worthing Food Network, with Sarah and Jess from Community Works, and have a think about what the next stages look like in terms of what the next kind of pieces of work in terms of conversation. Who do we share it with? How do we share it? I mean, I'm hoping to do a bit of a talk on it in Liverpool at the World Transformed this weekend. So there are moves where we are starting to have this conversation. We've got the report which we'll be sending out and publicising and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's something we've got to do, Neil, in order to think through how we start to broaden this conversation and really spread this as widely as possible. So any ideas people have are very, very welcome.
Great, thank you, Carl. And just to say, this session is being recorded, so we will publish it online. So we'll send it out to you. So please share it far and wide with anybody that will listen to it. We've obviously got the report that Carl has published, which is in quite a user-friendly reading format. So to send that out everywhere would be great.
Can I just say, Sarah, it's user friendly now, but it wasn't when I wrote it. It's user friendly thanks to all the people who intervened to make it user friendly, particularly Brian and Hilary, who really knocked it into shape and made it something that people could read.
Great, thank you, Carl. What we've also done is pulled out some case studies directly from the research that kind of show why food support is needed, but not the answer. So just to use those wherever you want and wherever you can. And then obviously Carl's been speaking about the Right to Food event in November. So as soon as the information is available for that, we will make sure that is circulated around to everybody. So thank you all for coming today. Thank you to Carl. Thank you to Pat, and thank you to all the people that took part in the research. Thank you all for staying on to the end. It's great to see so many people who care about this issue and will continue fighting the cause. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good Friday and a